Cold Waters, RAF Coastal Command in the early stages of the Cold War. Enemy submarine activity, especially attacks against merchant shipping, posed a huge threat to Britain in the First World War. The Allies responded successfully to this threat in a number of ways. Naval aviation was part of that response. While instances of aircraft directly sinking or significantly damaging enemy submarines were very rare, merely keeping aircraft flying over vital sea lines acted as a deterrent and forced submarines to remain submerged. Come the end of the First World War, and submarines seem to have been largely forgotten by defence planners. Instead, the emphasis remained on big capital surface ships. If the Navy were more interested in fighting on rather than under the water, the Royal Air Force was more interested in attacking targets on land. In the interwar period, thinking on air power was dominated by ideas of offensive air forces that would take the fight to the enemy. Maritime aviation was largely neglected and very little thought given to anti-submarine warfare and its potential delivery from the air. There's no need to dwell on a summary of the Battle of the Atlantic or its potential impact on the Allied cause. As in the First World War, a defeat of the enemy submarine threat was brought about by a range of factors. By the second half of the Second World War, however, aircraft were playing a much more vital function than they had in the First War. Not only were they acting as a deterrent, they were also now much more capable at destroying enemy submarines. As in the period immediately after the First War, that following the Second War saw huge cuts to defence expenditure. RAF Coastal Command was no exception to this. With the U-boats gone, maritime patrol aircraft were repurposed for air policing and supply duties across the world. Cold water had been poured onto Coastal Command's specialised anti-submarine warfare functions that were perfected during the Second War. There were 21 years of peace between November 1918 and September 1939. The period between the end of the Second World War and the ill-defined beginning of the Cold War was far shorter. Both periods, however, saw rapid defence cuts, followed by rapid rearmament, as new political tensions materialised. But if anti-submarine aviation had been completely neglected after the First World War, the lessons learned after the Second War did not altogether fade. As the enemy submarine threat re-emerged in the early 1950s, this time from the Soviets, the RAF and RM, although much reduced in size, were not taken on quite the same back foot as they had been 10 years earlier. I'd like to explore what caused this change in attitudes to submarines and focus on several factors. Firstly, by the end of the Second World War, the RAF had emerged as a mature service and did not face the same sort of existential threats to its independence as it had in the immediate post-First World War period. With reduced but never entirely absent inter-service rivalry, the RAF as a service had warmer attitudes to joint operations, as well as research and development. Secondly, RAF Coastal Command and aircraft in general had demonstrated that they were an effective anti-submarine warfare force, more than a mere deterrent, from having made no U-boat kills in the First World War to contributing around half in the Second War. Aircraft had come to the fore as an anti-submarine warfare weapon. Thirdly, the 1914 to 1918 U-boat campaign and the Battle of the Atlantic had very different conclusions. By 1918, Germany's U-boats were a spent force with broken crews. Although the Allies managed to turn the tide against the resurgence of U-boats in 1943, the menace never really went away, thanks to several German innovations. There had been no single miracle cure, and both services, RAF and Navy, have been kept on their feet. And fourthly, the Navy ended the First World War with little interest in submarines, and even tried to ban them. The same cannot be said about naval attitudes at the end of the Second World War. One of the ways in which this is most markedly reflected is in the disposal of German U-boat fleets following the end of both World Wars. From propaganda display pieces at the end of the First World War to objects of scientific inquiry in the Second World War, This shift in how U-boat fleets were disposed of perhaps tells us a lot about the changing attitudes to submarine warfare. Tom Hopkins, RAF Museum.